Welcome to On the Beat, the pulse of gynecologic oncology, brought to you by the Regroupement des gynécologues oncologues du Québec, RGOQ. Before we begin, a brief disclaimer. This podcast is supported by an unrestricted educational grant from AstraZeneca. The content, expert selection, and topics discussed are fully independent, and the opinions expressed are those of our experts, free from any influence by AstraZeneca. This discussion is intended solely for healthcare professionals and is for informational purposes only. It is not medical advice and should not be taken out of context. By listening, you agree that this content is not intended for patients or the general public. For personalized medical advice, please consult a qualified healthcare provider. Now, let's get started and explore the pulse of gynecologic oncology.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of our RGOQ podcast. And today I have a great honor to be with Dr. Shannon Salvador, who needs no introduction. But for the purpose of this talk, Dr. Salvador is a leading gynae oncologist here in Montreal. I'm the head of colposcopy at the Jewish General Hospital and now the president of the GOC. And today we'll be talking about HPV testing and cervical cancer prevention, which is really one of Dr. Salvador's passions. So welcome, Shannon. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me here. It's wonderful.
So we're really just going to have a little informal discussion. So really something that's up and coming is we're talking a lot about primary HPV testing and how it's being introduced. And there's the new ENS guidelines. And so it's kind of hard to know, is it implemented? Is it upcoming? So I just wanted to hear your point of view and where we're at in the current day and time.
To talk about sort of where we're at right now, I do have to go back and talk about where we came from and why we're sort of in this unusual situation that we're in right now with these guidelines that, as you said, it's very confusing. Are we using them? Are we not using them? What's happening? And so this actually goes back to 2017 when a group of experts and stakeholders in the province of Quebec, they came together and they created the first recommendations to INES for primary HPV testing. So it actually goes all the way back then. And these were submitted to the INES, and the INES reviewed them. And at that time in 2017, they were in favor. Absolutely, we should be proceeding with primary HPV testing for women over the age of 30 and women under the age of 30 between 25 and 30 to change the previous guidelines, which were really quite old at this point in time, to doing PAP testing only between the ages of 20 to 25 to bridge the gap there before using HPV testing. The previous guidelines, which unfortunately are still kind of in place, actually start PAP testing at age 21. And we know that's actually not useful. You should not be PAP testing women under the age of 25. This all even stemmed back to previous guidelines, which still stand in the whole of Canada that are extremely old, even using PAP testing and not switching over to HPV. And there are a number of people who have been working for years to try and get those changed, but it's been very, very difficult to work through some of the bureaucratic red tape that have been in place. So in Quebec, when these guidelines were put forward before INES, this was actually a bit revolutionary for the whole of Canada. This province probably would have been one of the first provinces, if not the first province, to make the change. And so most other countries had already started making the change. And now Canada is actually in a position of being one of the last countries of our means changing over to primary HPV testing. So things were in work. I actually sat on that committee. I was part of the group. We were hopeful. 2018, we were making some talks and discussions. We were creating the algorithms at that time. And then it was odd that we just kept feeling like there was just continual red tape that was being put in place. And we were constantly being sent back sort of to the drawing board of relooking at how we were doing this. And we even came back and said, look, economically, this makes so much more sense. It's a huge economic savings to the province. But I think it was a bit of the upfront cost because it did require purchasing large volume machines to do the PCR testings, and it did require this upfront cost to put in place to get the HPV testing. And I almost felt like that became the barrier, and sort of no one wanted to write that into a healthcare budget somewhere of that extreme cost there to get it up and running, despite the long-term savings that were coming down the line. And so just when we felt we were getting movement, we were coming into 2019 and we were being told 2020 was the year. And then, of course, we all know what happened in 2020. And unfortunately, COVID completely stopped absolutely all the work that was being done at that point in time. And the same machines that they do for the COVID testing are the machines that we would use for HPV testing. So all of that completely got diverted. And we all sat there going, oh no, because HPV testing during the time of COVID would have been fabulous. It's a test that is once every 5 years, not like Pap testing once every 3 years. You can even do self-collection, which I know we're going to talk about, which would have probably saved us a lot of the problems with screening that occurred during COVID that we are very much feeling the aftermath right now. I have never had so many locally advanced cervix cancers coming to our clinics.
Agree. It's a lot.
It's a lot. And all of that is a lack of screening more than anything else during these previous 5 years with COVID and obviously the inability to get into a family doctor's office. We all know the physician shortage in primary care that exists in Quebec, and not just here, but all of Canada. So there's a real problem with trying to achieve primary screening.
But I think also with COVID, you know, that the anti-vaccine movement was a big thing. And then like people were more thinking of testing for COVID and like, you know, worrying about the symptoms and are we going to die of COVID and all the consequences rather than, you know, getting their Pap test and their screening.
Not coming in to get screened because they don't want to go to a physician's office. And so there was so many things there that just led to a real decline in the actual screening numbers during that time.
And I think you were mentioning the machine of the HPV testing itself, but I think even going back, like when I came back from Ontario to Quebec, I couldn't believe like we were still using pencils and like
writing on the slide.
And I was like, well, like the medium is exactly the same as liquid-based cytology. So if like all the clinics already had the normal medium to do Pap tests, then we would already be like a little bit ahead or where we should be.
But so instead we're still putting it on a slide. It was just wild when we sort of look at where we were sitting and the supplies that were being provided to the physicians' offices and being able to do the testing. So we come through COVID, and then on the other side of it, in 2022, the committee re-met, that expert committee re-met, and they again rewrote the HPV guidelines to update them now, because so much time had passed since 2017. The technology, again, was just that much further along. And what was really important is the knowledge was really starting to come about how much self-collection and self-sampling could be useful to the Quebec population, to be able to provide those who were in remote communities or in marginalized communities, those who may not feel comfortable going to a physician's office, to have a speculum exam with an HPV test done or a Pap test done, and be able to do it even in the comfort of their own home. And the technology had advanced very significantly there, that we had reasonable and useful self-sampling swabs in other countries and locations that were using it successfully in their population. So they rewrote the guidelines again to include a possibility of self-sampling. And once again, NS accepted the guidelines and said, absolutely, this is perfect. This is what we should be doing. And that was in 2022. And we're still sitting here in anticipation of, and there is really excellent government websites, actually, with a lot of information that have all been prepared with HPV about what the test is, how to do it, even some information on self-collection and then the frequencies. What do you do with these? They have these algorithms, they're all
Yeah, I was just going to
prepared.
say the algorithms are very, very detailed, but
Yeah.
it's just people are still, I think even the family doctors, everyone is still wondering, like, what do we do? And
Yeah.
even if you have a positive HPV test, then, the NS still supports that you have to do some kind of cytology at some point. And so I think people are still a little bit confused.
As to how this works out.
Mhm.
And so the government sort of started with a rolling method across the province to try and implement this. And when you sort of sit there and say, wondering, well, why did they do that? Why didn't they just go ahead and say, this is how we're switching, everyone's switching, go ahead and do it? And I think the worry was some experiences that some other countries had been having, that when they did a sudden switchover, there was a massive peak in referrals to the colposcopy clinics that do the follow-ups of HPV because of the sheer number of volume of positive HPV tests that were coming in a very short period of time. And so I think they were trying to avoid that, because typically when most countries implement, and in Australia had a beautiful paper on what happened to them, is that it almost went up by 10 times the number of referrals, and that lasted for about a year. And then it went to 10 times less the referrals than what they were getting before. And that's because all the individuals who were identified as HPV positive in that first year were the people that needed to be followed. And thereafter, those who were negative were out of the screening for the next 5 years. And so there was no further new ones kind of coming in. They were trickling in slowly, but not like that first peak that they got. So now they actually have almost 10 times fewer people in colpo
and
than
we
they were
have the
having
data,
before.
right, from these centers. So I think that's what's key, is really to have data from these countries. And I just feel like it's very unfortunate that here we don't collect data from even our own colposcopy clinics to really understand and to inform these guidelines. Like, for example, like, I'm not sure if you've transitioned, but now, like, post-sleep, we have to have 2 negative colpos. And then there was another one where you have to have 3 negative ones. And you're like, well, where did these come from? There's actually data from Ontario that, like, 1 colposcopy is sufficient.
With a negative HPV test, and you are good to go. I know.
Where does it come from?
It's very odd how some of these algorithms were written. And so now, to get back to your original question, where are we right now? So we're at a point in time that there's a list of the communities. I found the website again today, and I went back to look to see who has access now. And I know it started in Gaspésie, and then they kept rolling it out to various groups. I remember when Laval got it, we were all like, oh, well, if Laval has it, Montreal has to be next on the list. And I still see that we're kind of with a no next to Montreal of us officially being switched over to primary HPV testing here. And I know, as being head of colpo, I'm getting phone calls all the time as to when is it going to happen. And so my most recent check is, it seems like we're still only with maybe about 30% of the province actually getting approval to switch over from HAP testing to HPV testing. I am aware that in Montreal, the machine is ready to go. The people who work with it, because I've been in conversations with them, they're completely ready to go. In fact, they're sitting there just waiting. They've been actually ready probably since April. Test is validated. They're using the HPV Roche test. They are good to go. And it feels like there's still some holdback, and they're not quite sure what is happening there. And there's a bit of conversation of even, well, do we do a period of accepting both? They probably will for a while, as family physicians' offices and other collection offices run through their supplies and finish their supplies of PAP, but then switch over to the HPV. And there's probably going to be a period that they are accepting both with this. And so, is it going to happen before the end of 2025? I'm really hopeful. I was expecting a year ago that we were going to be there already here in Montreal.
I think I'm still like a little bit naive as to all, like, in terms of policy and how things change. Like, is someone going to go on the news and be like, today is the day? Or like, it's funny. Like, I've never, through med school and residency, and you never really think of how things change in a hospital system. Like I think, it's usually like hospital based. Okay, like we don't have scrub gel anymore, or we don't have this, but today we have it. So like it's like kind of internal, but how, like, is someone going to go on the news? Is there going to be a big like email?
What I am aware is that there's some things in the works to try and push this along in the media. At the time that we're recording this, I am aware that there will likely be a fairly large push from the francophone media, which will probably spill over throughout all the media in Quebec about why the delay. I think people are starting to really question why the delay when everyone seems to be ready to go. Algorithms are ready. Colposcopy clinics have been ready. We are all prepared for the influx. I know, because we've been getting ready for what we think is going to be a year of a lot of positive HPV tests, but just the needs to follow these patients, not necessarily provide treatments. And that's fine. We're good to go, and we're just waiting for the final approval for it to happen.
And as a colposcopist, let's say you get a referral for HPV other, like what would you recommend? Would you recommend, send back cytology test in a year, or would you kind of agree to see them just in the meantime that we're getting things?
Yeah, so that comes back to how are these algorithms working out? And there is good data for this as well. We're definitely not the only province that's going to be following a similar algorithm to this, is that we're obviously testing for HPV, and it's a strong recommendation from all groups that are doing this that we should be genotyping the HPV. So we know the specific subtype. If it is a 16, 18, HPV subtype, they are going to come to colposcopy automatically. And the reason why we are asking for reflex cytology on that, with that, if we do have the liquid sample and it's available, is because that allows triage to happen faster. Because obviously if we get a triage that the cytology is showing HSIL and something more concerning, then we're going to see that patient usually within 4 to 6 weeks. We're not going to delay them longer. Whereas if it shows nothing, then we will see them, but likely more in a 6 to 12 week range. It just gives us a little more flexibility with triage, but we'll absolutely be bringing them to COPO. If we have one of the other subtypes, the current triage is to do the follow-up cytology. Again, we see HSIL, they come to us, they come to COPO. If they're seeing something other than an HSIL, a glandular tumor, an AIS, or it's undefined, they can't determine it, then we're recommending to repeat the HPV test in a year to see what happens. And so obviously if the person clears negative, then it just might have been a false positive, no problem, and we'll carry back on with the routine screening of once every 5 years. However, if that repeat test again comes back saying positive, the current algorithm is, again, do the cytology. If it's something worrisome, you send them to COPO. If it's not, they're even saying bring them back in another year. So it's actually turning into 2 consecutive years of 3 HPV positive tests before someone ends up coming to COPO with these other subtypes. That's, of course, for our general population. If you actually get into a population that is somehow immunocompromised, that changes that.
Yeah, it's very different.
Yeah, exactly. We're testing you more frequently, and if you're immunocompromised, we tend to just say, look, you got an HPV positive, just come. We will see you no matter what that shows. Yeah.
It's very interesting. Lots of changes. I feel like I'm still being asked, like in COPO, why are you doing an HPV test? And we still have to justify it. And it should just be like, this is the standard. And I feel like we still haven't changed. So lots to work on and lots of food for thought. So, and do we have data yet on the effect of vaccination and like the prevalence of like the HPV, if it's coming down? I feel like in Quebec, we probably don't have these numbers. And I feel like you said, because of COVID, there was like also a dip in vaccination. So what are your thoughts on that? And
yeah, vaccination is interesting because, of course, we're working with numbers where the vaccinated cohort that were appropriately vaccinated in their youth, prior to any type of sexual exposure, are approaching the ages of 25 to 27 right now, depending where in Canada they're at. And so that's where we're at. There was the catch-up group, because obviously it was offered to anyone who was still in grade school at that time. And those groups are actually age 29, 30 this year is where they're hitting, which is kind of exciting. But in that group, because it wasn't at the recommended age of grade 4, we might be still dealing with some HPV exposure prior to the vaccination. So what we are seeing is, and there has been studies on this, there are definitely reduced numbers of genital warts and condylomas because of the vaccine use and reducing those numbers. In the countries that did start sooner than us, they are already showing a decreased number of HSILs being present in the clinic because of the vaccination cohort. And their numbers of patients, of people who are testing HPV positive between the ages of 25 to 30 in that vaccinated cohort, are greatly reduced from the general population. So yes, it is doing what it's supposed to do. It's still going to be another 10 to 15 years before we see the cancer influx and the influence on the cancer diagnoses, because those are typically happening between the ages of about 45 to 55 when we see the max ages there. But we're definitely getting fewer numbers in COPO. And so that also has to do with how they rewrote the guidelines. Because remember when I said in 2017, they said between the ages of 25 to 30, they were still saying do PAPS. If we notice, the most recent NS are just over the age of 25. You just do HPV.
HPV, yeah.
And the reason they remove that is because of the HPV vaccination, is that we're anticipating that testing that age group, because they're now the vaccinated cohort is in that age group, we're actually going to see very many high numbers of HPV positive individuals. And so that's the influence of the vaccination cohort in Quebec when they rewrote the guidelines. Just you're over the age of 25, keep it simple. No PAP testing, just HPV.
Yeah. That's great. That's really, hopefully we'll get there soon and get to change. And so we were talking a little bit as well about self-sampling. So this kind of came up because so some of us, Annie, Laurence, we were reviewing some of the applications for the GOC, that great initiative that you guys got me part of when I was a resident. So, I really got some great applications and a lot from other provinces. It seemed like they, we're going to get these kits easily available. So I just wanted to see where that's at in Quebec, because I read in the NS guidelines that it's really only actually a select population that can have self-sampling, correct?
Yeah, actually, that was the original thought. The most recent is actually thinking we should open it to the entire population of Quebec. Anyone who has a cervix and needs testing, that it should be available. Now, obviously, the focus is going to be in the under screened population, so the marginalized or distant population who perhaps can't get easy access. But at some point in time, because this is what they're doing in British Columbia, we want self-sampling to be available to anyone who wants to do self-sampling. And so what does that mean? So in BC, what it means for them is they actually did an internal swab. They developed their own swab and they validated it themselves. And it is a swab that can actually be sent in the mail. So you can actually log on to a website, you put your name in, you request a swab, it gets sent to your house, and it gives you the instructions on exactly how to do it, where to put the swab, how long, et cetera, and then put it into the sampling kit and send it back in the mail. And as long as it's received within a certain amount of time and has these other criteria, and then they test it, and there's certain things that they look for to validate the swab, that's the accepted HPV. Now, of course, the downside to doing a mailed swab is you can't then do reflex cytology.
Right.
So if you have one of the other subtypes in BC, they do have a very robust database, and that's very important with self-sampling. You have to have an incredibly robust database and a group that's following these so that you don't miss a positive test. And someone who has a positive test actually has someone reaching out and calling them and telling them where to go to then do the reflex cytology or to to get to Colpo. So that's what they did in BC. Now,
so that I was just going to ask. So when the test comes back, it's actually managed by the structured program with someone working. So it's
very structured program
great.
in British Columbia with nurse practitioners who are monitoring the tests and making sure that in the database they know who's been screened, who hasn't been screened. If someone's been positively screened, are they actually getting follow-ups? In fact, they've got it so down pat, they even know if someone's had a colposcopy or not, and within a certain time frame. And so their database will flag someone who has a positive test but no recorded colposcopy. So that's how they've set it up. And that's why BC has been one of the most advanced groups for cervical cancer screening. And they actually have one of the lowest cervical cancer rates in Canada right now. They're kind of on that way to meet that WHO goal of less than 4 in 100,000. I would love to say the rest of Canada's there, but we are definitely not. In fact, even since COVID, the cervical cancer rate has actually been increasing again. We got to a nice low in about 2016 of around 6 to 8 per 100,000, and it's actually gone back up, and we're probably sitting somewhere between 8 to 10 right now, unfortunately.
Well, I have to say we get 6 per 8 a month. So.
Yeah, I know. It's really...
So it's definitely a different population, but it just goes to prove that, lack of primary health care, lack of vaccination, and it's this specific population that can probably benefit, right, from the self-sampling. But, again, how do you get it out there? And, I'm sure BC, they'll probably send you a letter. When I went to do my fellowship in Ontario, it was a letter in the mail with your result. And, and then tells you when the follow-up is, and it's not me writing the letter, which is what we do now in Colpo, right?
Exactly.
We have to send the patients back, so it's a lot of burden on the physician, whereas clearly it should be province-wide, like the mammogram program here.
Exactly, and something that's already automatic, that it's kick-started from a database saying you tested, not tested. So little side note there, the difficulty with that with Pap testing is that Pap testing always fell under cytology, which fell under pathology, which is not recorded in the DSQ in Quebec, whereas HPV testing is a lab test. So that is actually falling under that DSQ umbrella, that it's a little easier to follow what happens there in the DSQ system. So there is a potential there to create a program like that sort of can fall within, I know, the current laws in Quebec that make it very difficult sometimes to maintain databases due to privacy laws. So it's a workaround that potentially can be utilized now here in this province. So when you sit there and say, okay, well, that's what BC did, that's their internal swab, that's how they're doing it. They do also have an available self-collection swab that is in a liquid based as well, that can be done in a healthcare clinic and just guided by a nurse, here it is, go into this room, do it, put it in the thing. So that is available too. Now, what do we have here in Quebec? So Health Canada has approved self-sampling, self-collection systems. And so there is one with Roche, there's one with Hologic BD Life Sciences. They do have these collection swabs with the medium. There is a swab that is a mail swab, like a mail out swab that can be sent through the mail. And they have been approved by Health Canada. So it's a matter of these do exist, and do the provinces then, as they do with anything else, create a contract with the various suppliers to then provide that to their population if they want to use these commercialized swabs. And then who analyzes those? Where are they analyzed? Do they go to a central system, which is what happens when people you can get HPV self-sampling privately. It is possible. You go, you log in, you pay, they send it to your house, you send it back, they contact you. So that all exists. But in most provinces, if you're doing something like this, you want to try and bring it under your umbrella of your own lab, because then it's obviously much cheaper and it's very cost savings. So to do anything like that, and that's what it states in the NS guidelines, is that if that is going to happen, it really does require, again, a strong validation of a self-collection swab that, just like BC did, that then stands up to an actual swab collected by a physician. And so there was some concern when Norway did their switch over and they were using self-sampling swabs as well as HPV swabs, that maybe they were losing some of the sensitivity and the specificity, and they had some information that it was almost like a 10% loss. So there was a worry there. But that was with an old collection system. They have since updated the collection system and the PCR testing. And so Australia now has very good evidence that their self-collection swab was performing just as well as any swab done in a physician's office. And their most recent analysis that they did showed that the self-collection swab increase their numbers post-COVID because they were having difficulty with COVID with collection. By doing self-collection, it brought their numbers almost back to what they were before COVID. So they're still not quite there yet, but they do anticipate this year when they collect the data, they'll probably be back up. And self-collection made that possible for Australia to do that. And that's again why when we didn't have HPV testing here in Quebec, we all went, oh no, because we knew self-collection was there and possible and could have helped us through that period, that it did help with Australia and is still helping with them to get their numbers back up despite the same things that we have. Inability to reach a family physician, difficulty getting access to healthcare, and then still dealing with remote communities, which, as you can imagine, in Australia is some of the most remote communities around. So
I think thankfully with COVID, people are used to testing themselves and like putting them in the little...
Exactly. If we can shove a swab up here, there's other places we can put one too.
So I think it kind of was a little bit of some kind of blessing where like, you know, the population got into that. So anything else that's kind of up and coming in Canada since you're...
Well, there's a couple of interesting things. So vaccination, we can't obviously do this without talking about vaccination. So HPV vaccination, possibly one of the best, most robust vaccination programs out there with our grade school vaccination across Canada. There was obviously when we started an immense buy-in. The numbers in Canada were really high, well over 80%, in some locations even higher. And then obviously with anti-vaccination movements sort of going, that has fallen. Some provinces are actually down around 50% now, which is a real shame because it's become an opt-in as opposed to an opt-out situation. Quebec actually has a very high number of vaccinated individuals in Quebec. We have a population that is very strongly supportive of vaccination here. So our numbers here have never fallen below 80. They've always been up there. And so we do enjoy a very high vaccination population here, but people need to be aware that doesn't exist elsewhere. So hence you can't depend on herd immunity if you go somewhere else that doesn't necessarily exist. And one of the big things about trying to reach this WHO goal, eradicating cervix cancer, really has to do with that high vaccination rate. We really do need it above 80, even approaching 90% to achieve that. And obviously we're vaccinating both the boys and the girls because HPV, as we all know, anal cancer, vulvar cancer, penile cancer, oral cancers, head and neck cancer. Yeah, it's all of them. And those are cancers that, cervix is between the ages of 45 to 55 typically, but then you're looking at vulvar cancers in your 60s and anal cancers around the same age. The head and neck cancers are typically older, around the ages of 70s and 80s. So these are all things that we're looking, 50 years down the line for these individuals who are vaccinated now. It seems sort of long and remote, but by vaccinating them now and preventing this, that's what we're looking for in the future. So when we first vaccinated, as we all know, we were doing 3. And then with studies, they were looking at the serology rates of being able to maintain this high serology rate in your bloodstream. And from that alone, they dropped it to 2. And they said, okay, that seems reasonable. And since we've been watching and looking at ongoing studies of the rates of HSIL and do people still maintain an excellent rate of serology in their bloodstream with just 2, the answer seems to be yes. So the next natural question is,
can we do 1?
Can we do 1? And so it's been interesting. When there was first noise of doing this, I actually felt it was very premature. And I was like, there's not much there for us to suddenly be switching to 1. This is a little worrisome. Since that time, there have been sort of accidental studies that have come out where there was a study that was ongoing trying to show that that 2 vaccinations in a certain population, but because of social issues in the country they were running it. They actually only managed to give one to majority of the individuals who were in that study. And so they followed those girls now becoming women, and it looks like their serology rates, again, have remained up. So it was sort of an accidental one-dose vaccination study. And from that, it does seem like one is probably enough. Of course, only time tells on that, and it requires you to continually follow these people going forward in that study and looking. So what has that resulted in? It resulted in a group in Canada looking at the economic means of doing one versus two. How much money do you save? What do you need to do this? And of course, the big things are you have to know who's been vaccinated, you have to maintain a database, and you have to follow them forward. And you have to have a high vaccination rate.
Right.
That really requires that. So Quebec has switched from 2 to 1. And I was still a little like, oh, that was a little surprising. In fact, with the length of time it took us to try and get HPV test in, I was like, that happened in under half a year of switching from 2 to 1. So I was like, oh, you're fast on some things, but not on others, apparently.
It's like saving money and
saving
back.
money, we're done. Okay, that's it, 2 to 1.
Yeah.
And so that's where we are right now. And the one thing Quebec does have is they do know who's been vaccinated. It's actually a very, very clear information. They know that very well who's been vaccinated. And we do enjoy a high vaccination rate here. So they've got 2 of their things. And I do know that they are following various populations for their ongoing serology. However, does that mean that in 20 years, if they see that dropping, are they going to come back and say to all the one-dosers, oops, sorry, you should have actually received a second?
Right.
I don't know about that. But then again, so much time will have passed at that point in time. Who knows what sort of new treatments, new this, anything that might exist out there. We might be doing this completely differently by then.
It's true. Anyhow, this was really informative and such great conversations as usual. Such a beacon of knowledge. So thank you so much. And we hope you'll join us on our next podcast.
All right. My pleasure.
Thank you for joining us on the Beat, the Pulse of Gynecologic Oncology. We hope today's episode offered valuable insights. For more content and to stay informed, visit us at rgoq.ca. Until next time, stay informed, stay connected, and continue advancing the care of women with gynecologic cancers.